A hush fell over the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, a silence so heavy it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. The man stood there, hands trembling, his eyes locked onto the judge, the one person who held his fate in their hands. His voice, raw and filled with desperation, broke the silence. "Your Honor, I just want to say goodbye to my dog. Please, just once." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor scoffed. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The judge's face was unreadable. The dog, a loyal companion who had stood by him through the darkest moments of his life, was being taken away. Forever. And this was his final request. Everyone expected the judge to issue a swift and cold rejection. But then, something happened. The judge's expression changed. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes locked onto the man before him. And when he finally spoke, no one could believe what he said next. "Small Blue Diamond, what did the judge decide? Why was this one moment so powerful? Small Blue Diamond, and how did this man's bond with his dog lead to a decision that would shock the world? Stay with me because this is a story you will never forget." The man in the courtroom was Daniel Carter, a former police officer with a reputation for integrity and a heart that bled for justice. But today, he wasn't standing in uniform. He wasn't the respected officer who had spent years protecting the community. Today, he was an inmate, a convicted felon. His once strong posture was weighed down by the burden of the past. His hands, calloused from years of service, were now shackled together, a painful reminder of how drastically his life had changed. But Daniel wasn't fighting for his freedom. Not anymore. He had accepted his sentence, no matter how unfair it was. Today, he was fighting for something even more important, a final moment with his K9 partner, Shadow. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was Daniel's partner, protector, and only real family. Through the years, they had faced life-threatening situations together. Drug busts, hostage rescues, and the kind of danger that most people couldn't even imagine. In the darkest moments of his career, Shadow had been his rock. The one who never judged him. The one who always stood by his side. But now, Daniel was being stripped of everything that ever mattered to him. After his conviction, Shadow was reassigned to another officer, as if their years together meant nothing. And soon, Daniel would be transferred to a maximum security prison, where he would likely never see Shadow again. Unless the judge showed mercy. Unless the court allowed one final goodbye. His lawyer had warned him, the chances were slim. The system wasn't built to honor personal requests like this. The prosecution objected, arguing that Daniel was a convicted criminal and didn't deserve special treatment. But was this really special treatment? Or was it just a basic act of humanity? Daniel stood in that courtroom, his heart pounding, his throat dry. He had faced gunfire, tackled criminals twice his size, and stared death in the face, but nothing compared to this moment. Would the judge grant his request? Or would the law once again prove that justice had no place for compassion? The courtroom was silent. Every eye in the room was fixed on Daniel Carter, the once revered officer who now stood before the judge in a prison jumpsuit. His request had been simple, one last moment with Shadow. Just a few minutes to say goodbye to the partner who had stood by his side through every storm. But the prosecutor wasn't having it. "Your Honor, we cannot set a precedent where convicted felons get to make personal requests," the prosecutor argued coldly. His words stung. As if Daniel's years of service meant nothing. As if Shadow was just another tool, easily replaced, easily reassigned. The judge adjusted her glasses and sighed. The weight of the decision was evident on her face. "Mr. Carter, the law does not provide allowances for personal goodbyes," she stated. Daniel's stomach tightened. Was that it? Was this already over? But then, something unexpected happened. Just as the judge was about to move on, someone stood up from the gallery. It was Officer Mark Evans, a former colleague of Daniel's. "Your Honor, if I may," Evans' voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable emotion behind it. The judge nodded hesitantly. Evans cleared his throat. "I worked with Daniel Carter for nearly a decade. And I can tell you this, he wasn't just a good cop. He was the best. And if there's one thing I know for sure, it's that Shadow isn't just a dog to him. He's family." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even some of the officers present seemed to shift uncomfortably. Because deep down they all knew it was true. Evans continued. We send K9s into danger alongside us. We trust them with our lives. And when we lose them, it's just as painful as losing a fellow officer. If Shadow were a human partner, we wouldn't even be questioning this. We'd already be granting Daniel the chance to say goodbye. The judge pressed her lips together. She wasn't unmoved. But she was bound by the law. She turned back to Daniel. You understand why this is complicated, don't you? Daniel nodded. I do, Your Honor. But I also know that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about humanity. A long pause. Then the judge exhaled. I'll take a brief recess before making my ruling. She stood up, and just like that, the decision was hanging in the air. Daniel swallowed hard. Would this be the last time he ever had hope? The courtroom doors swung open, and the judge disappeared into her chambers. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on Daniel's chest like a heavy stone. Minutes felt like hours. He could hear Shadow's faint whines from the hallway, where the K9 officer was kept under guard. The thought of never seeing him again was unbearable. Would the judge grant him this one final request? Or would she uphold the strictness of the law? As the judge deliberated, conversations buzzed through the courtroom. Speech balloons, some officers whispered among themselves. Righto, I get it, but we can't make exceptions. Righto, yeah, but it's just a few minutes. What's the harm? Speech balloon, the prosecutor remained cold and firm. Righto, if we bend the law for him, what stops others from demanding the same? Speech balloon, Daniel's supporters, including Mark Evans, stood their ground. Righto, this isn't about bending the law, it's about doing what's right. The tension wasn't just about Daniel and Shadow anymore. It was about something bigger. Was the system capable of mercy? In the hallway, Shadow paced restlessly. The K9 handler holding his leash had worked with him before. He saw the signs. Shadow was anxious, unsettled. He knew. Dogs had a way of sensing emotions, and Shadow could feel that something was wrong. His ears twitched at every faint sound from the courtroom. His tail, usually wagging with pride, hung low. And then, he did something unexpected. With a sharp whimper, Shadow pulled forward, straining against his leash, his nose pointing toward the courtroom doors. It was instinct. Loyalty. But the guard tightened his grip. Easy, boy. I know. The K9 handler wasn't heartless. But orders were orders. Would Shadow's silent plea be ignored, just like Daniel's? Finally, the courtroom doors opened, and the judge emerged, her expression unreadable. She took her seat. The murmurs died instantly. Daniel held his breath. This was it. The judge cleared her throat and locked eyes with him. Mr. Carter, after careful consideration, I have reached a decision. She paused, just long enough for every heartbeat in the room to feel like a drum roll. Would justice show mercy? Would Daniel get to say goodbye? Or would the system's cold rules prevail? The judge's gaze remained fixed on Daniel, her expression unreadable. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Then she spoke. This court has always upheld the law. But today, we are faced with a question that goes beyond rules and regulations. We are faced with a matter of the heart. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He clenched his fists under the table, afraid to hope. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the documents in front of her. Then, in a softer voice, she continued. Mr. Carter, I have reviewed your service record, your dedication to your community, and most importantly, your history with Shadow. She took a deep breath and turned toward the courtroom. This is not just a dog. This is a partner. A companion. A protector. A few officers in the room nodded in silent agreement. Even those who had been against Daniel started to feel the weight of the moment. Daniel and Shadow had been through everything together. Broken heart, they had trained side by side. Broken heart, they had fought crime together. Broken heart, they had nearly lost their lives protecting each other. And now, they were being forced apart. The judge's voice softened even more. Shadow is not just any K9. He is family. And family deserves a proper goodbye. Daniel felt his vision blur with emotion. He had held himself together for as long as he could, but now, it was unbearable. Your Honor, Please. His voice cracked. I don't care what happens to me. I don't care if I have to spend the rest of my life behind bars. But Shadow, he doesn't understand why I'm gone. He doesn't deserve to be left wondering. He doesn't deserve to think I abandoned him. His hands trembled. He was no longer pleading for himself. He was pleading for Shadow. The judge watched him closely. Then she did something unexpected. She set her gavel down. The courtroom gasped. For the first time, there was a crack in her stern demeanor. The judge sat back in her chair, her eyes distant, as if remembering something. Then she spoke. Many years ago, I had a German shepherd named Max. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one expected this. He was an AK-9 officer, but he was my best friend. He was there when I needed him. And when he passed, I never got the chance to say goodbye. The room fell completely silent. I still regret it to this day. Her voice grew thick with emotion. No one should have to live with that kind of pain. She inhaled deeply, composing herself. Then she turned back to Daniel. And that is why. I have made my decision. The air was thick with tension. Would the judge allow Daniel to say goodbye? Or would the law prove to be unyielding? The answer was just seconds away. The judge's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow. Mr. Carter, the judge began slowly, her voice steady yet filled with an unexpected empathy. I cannot grant you complete freedom, but I will make an exception for Shadow. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Every eye was fixed on the judge, every ear straining to catch her next words. The judge raised her gavel and slammed it down with authority, but instead of the usual finality, her voice carried an unusual tenderness. I hereby grant you a temporary release, Mr. Carter, under the condition that you are accompanied by an officer at all times. You will be allowed to visit Shadow for one last time, under supervision. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't believe it. Was this real? Was he really being given a chance? But the judge wasn't finished. You will also be held accountable for your actions, and your case will still be reviewed after this visit. There are no guarantees. The courtroom was divided. Some officers exchanged glances of disbelief, others nodded in approval, recognizing the compassion behind the decision. Yet there were still skeptics, those who thought the law had been compromised. One officer stood up, shaking his head. This isn't how the system works, Your Honor. But the judge remained calm, her eyes piercing through the crowd. Sometimes it is not about the system. It's about humanity. As Daniel stood up, his hands were still shaking. He turned toward the door, ready to face the one thing he had longed for. But his mind was clouded with questions. Would Shadow remember him? Would they have a chance to heal? Or was this reunion going to be even harder than he imagined? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. He was being given a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. Thank you, Your Honor, Daniel whispered, barely able to contain the surge of gratitude that overwhelmed him. Just as Daniel turned to leave, the courtroom doors flew open. A man stormed in, his face twisted with anger. He was unfamiliar to the crowd, and his presence was unsettling. This is a mistake, the man shouted. You can't let him near that dog. He's dangerous. He doesn't deserve it. The room fell silent once more. Who was this man? And why was he so adamant that Daniel didn't deserve his last moment with Shadow? As security approached the man, he turned toward Daniel with fury in his eyes. You think you're the only one who cares about that dog? You have no idea what you've done. Daniel's mind raced. Who was this person, and what was his connection to Shadow? The courtroom held its breath as the man revealed the shocking truth. I'm the one who raised Shadow before he was partnered with you. I trained him. And you. He pointed a trembling finger at Daniel. You betrayed him. You don't deserve a second chance. The revelation left everyone in shock. The story they had all believed, about Daniel's loyalty to Shadow, was suddenly called into question. What was the true story behind Shadow's training? What did this man know that no one else did? As the tension built, the judge turned back to Daniel, her eyes narrowing with a mix of suspicion and concern. We have much more to discuss, Mr. Carter. The room was electric with tension, every eye fixated on the judge as she stared at the man who had just interrupted the proceedings. You're claiming that Mr. Carter betrayed the dog you trained? The judge's voice was sharp, demanding answers. The man's face was red with anger as he squared off with Daniel, who stood frozen in place, struggling to process what was happening. Yes, the man yelled, his voice trembling with emotion. I trained Shadow. I'm the one who made him the loyal, disciplined K9 he is today. And I know for a fact that Carter, he pointed accusingly at Daniel again. He abandoned Shadow. Left him to face unimaginable dangers in the field. You think he deserves a reunion? You have no idea what that dog went through. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. The accusations were brutal, but they also forced him to confront something he had buried deep inside himself. Had he really abandoned Shadow? Images of their time together flooded his mind. Training sessions, the bond they'd shared. But also the harsh moments, when he had let his own personal struggles push Shadow aside. The truth stung. Could this man be right? Was he as guilty as the stranger claimed? Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had never been good with words, especially when faced with his own failures. The courtroom became a battlefield of emotions. The man continued to hurl accusations, his voice growing more frantic. Shadow was my partner before he was yours. I trained him, trusted him, and you. He gestured violently toward Daniel. You abandoned him in the field. You don't get to come in here and pretend you have any right to say goodbye to that dog. Not after what you did. As the words hit Daniel like a battering ram, memories came flooding back. There had been moments, dangerous, terrifying moments, when he had prioritized his own well-being over Shadow's. And the guilt, it was suffocating. He had failed his loyal companion. The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She turned back to Daniel, her gaze piercing and intense. Mr. Carter, what do you have to say for yourself? Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced, his emotions torn between regret and the desperate need to make things right. He took a shaky breath and spoke, his voice low but steady. I was wrong, he began, his voice filled with raw emotion. I wasn't the partner that Shadow deserved. I was selfish and I failed him. The room was silent as Daniel's words hung in the air. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, but he didn't look away from the judge's eyes. But I don't want to die with that guilt. I just want one last chance to make it right. If I could see him one last time, I'd do whatever it takes to make it up to him. For the first time, the judge softened. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke, her voice carrying a mixture of authority and compassion. I am granting you that final chance, Mr. Carter. But let me be clear, this is not forgiveness. This is an opportunity for redemption. You will visit Shadow. You will apologize. You will make it right, but the consequences of your actions will follow you, no matter what happens. Daniel's heart soared, but there was no time to celebrate. The journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning of an emotional roller coaster that would change his life forever. As Daniel walked toward the kennel, his heart raced with anticipation. The heavy footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, a reminder that time was slipping through his fingers. The room was dimly lit, and a single light illuminated a large kennel in the center. And there, in the corner, lay Shadow. For a moment, everything stopped. It was as though the world had paused, leaving only the two of them in that moment. Shadow's fur had grown a little grayer, his movements slower, but his eyes, those familiar, soulful eyes, still held the spark that Daniel remembered. Daniel's voice cracked as he called out, Shadow. At the sound of his name, the dog's head snapped up. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Shadow didn't move. His eyes narrowed slightly, and Daniel's chest tightened. Had he forgotten him? Had their bond been broken by the years apart? Then, Shadow took a step forward, his body trembling as he moved closer. Daniel's eyes filled with tears as he knelt down, his arms outstretched, his heart open. I'm so sorry, Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't deserve you, but I'll never forget what you did for me. I'm sorry for abandoning you. I'll make it right, I swear. Shadow approached cautiously, his tail twitching as though testing the waters. Then, without warning, he lunged into Daniel's arms, his body warm and familiar. The tears flowed freely now, but they were not of guilt. They were tears of relief, of love, of the understanding that they were still connected despite everything that had happened. As Shadow rested his head on Daniel's lap, there was a quiet moment of peace between them. The weight of the years, the battles, the guilt, everything seemed to melt away in that simple, yet profound moment. Daniel stroked his dog's fur, feeling the years of pain and separation slip away. "We'll get through this together," he promised softly. The reunion wasn't just about Shadow forgiving Daniel, it was about Daniel learning to forgive himself. He realized that sometimes, redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, facing your mistakes, and doing everything you can to make things right. As the reunion came to an end, Daniel and Shadow sat together, their bond stronger than ever. But it wasn't without its scars. The truth was, they couldn't change the past. The guilt that Daniel carried would always linger in some way. But in that moment he understood something important. He had done all he could. The judge had given him a second chance, and now, it was up to him to ensure that this moment wasn't wasted. This wasn't just about an emotional reunion, it was about a promise to never repeat the mistakes of the past. As Daniel left the kennel, Shadow by his side, he knew that his life had been changed forever. The courtroom drama, the accusations, and the emotional moments all led to this one undeniable truth. Healing wasn't easy, but it was possible. "I'll never abandon you again, buddy," Daniel whispered to Shadow, the dog's tail wagging gently in response. The journey of redemption was just beginning, but Daniel had found peace. The past no longer held him hostage, and the future, no matter how uncertain, was something they would face together. As Daniel and Shadow walked away from the kennel, something caught Daniel's eye, something he hadn't noticed before. The same man who had accused him in court was standing outside, watching them. But there was something different in the man's eyes this time. Could there be more to the story? Was this truly over, or was there another layer of betrayal yet to be uncovered? The lingering question hung in the air as the screen faded to black. What do you think about Daniel's reunion with Shadow? Do you believe they'll be able to heal the wounds of the past completely, or is there more to the story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you think Daniel deserves a second chance, give this video a like and share it with your friends. We'd love to hear your opinions and keep the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible, emotional stories like this one.